Great. So I'm Dr. Shemmassian, and I'm excited to you again about medical school admissions and various parts of the application process. Today, I've spoken primarily about the medical school personal statement in the past. Unsurprisingly, that tends to be one of, if not like the most sort of popular topic on med school applications. But I'm really happy actually to talk to you today about the work and activities section. Reason being, I think that because so many students focus on the personal statement, you can argue that sometimes people over focus on the personal statement, right? They get very obsessive about like the perfect topic, about making sure that they have the right amount of experiences and all these different things that they I think sometimes lose sight of the overall picture, how the different pieces fit together. And I think that great applications, what they do particularly well is they consider how everything fits together. So the personal statement, setting the foundation for your medical school application, but other sections like work and activities, well, those really round things out. They talk about the day to day of what you did throughout undergrad and beyond. And then, of course, secondaries describe school specific fit. So every piece has its own special place, right? Has its own special function for the whole application. And today we're going to focus and talk about how to talk about the day to day activities that you participated in. So I've developed a 5 point formula for a great work and activity section, and we'll dig into it step by step. And like Christina said, at any point, if you have questions, you're welcome to write them in the Q&A section, and I'll be glad to answer them either during or at the end, whatever feels most appropriate. All right, we'll jump right in. So all right. So what we're going to cover today, number one, we're going to cover the importance of the work and activity section, why it's actually really critical to your application, the format, what does it look like, what all is covered in there, common questions that might come up, and then what admissions committees are looking for. Those probably the most important piece of it, right? Like how do you actually write about the work and activity section in a way that's compelling? How do you select what activities to write about? Especially what's considered a most meaningful experience, which we'll get into later, and then common mistakes people come across and additional tips to be successful. So a little bit about me. um, so I grew up in Los Angeles, actually, mostly in North Hollywood. So LA is very dear to me. And but when I was getting ready to go to college, I ended up going to Cornell for undergrad. So I guess the opposite of LA in many ways, in upstate New York in the cold. And I got my bachelor's degree in human development. I was actually pre-med the whole time, did quite well in college. But given, me growing up with Tourette syndrome, and I was doing a lot of mental health research at the time, decided to pivot and go into, get my PhD in clinical psychology at UCLA. So go Bruins. That's what makes me especially happy to speak with you guys today at my alma mater. And I've been helping students get into med school for nearly 20 years now, and seen it all. Sometimes I get students who ask me questions like, have you worked with a student like me who has this quality? Or have you worked with a student like me who, and the answer is always yes. I've done this work for quite a long time and have never, turned away anybody based on stats or anything like that. So, had the good pleasure of supporting students in pretty much every situation. And in terms of helping students get into med school, obviously developing the right school list, super important. Perhaps that's another presentation for another time. Writing great essays, which is part of what we're going to talk about today, and coaching taste interviews. And over 90% of our students in these nearly 20 years have gone into at least one school. So it's awesome that our students have been so successful. Cool. So I'll now transition into talking about the work and activity section and why it's so important. So before I even even get into all of the nitty gritty details, let's talk about why does this matter, right? So obviously the big problem here is that schools can't just offer an interview to everybody, right, who's academically qualified. And as much as we want to like distill and oversimplify this process and figure out our chances based on our stats, it just doesn't work that way, right? There are plenty of students who have sufficient stats to go into medical school, but to go into very good medical schools, but schools simply cannot offer positions to everyone, which is why they ask for writing in the first place. Um, and and you have to talk about, okay, outside of just numbers and where you went to school and all that kind of stuff, how did you spend your time? What did you do? What impact did you make? All of these other thing that sometimes students don't know is on the application, on the AMCAS application, which I'll talk about in a second. The work and activity section actually appears before your personal statement. Now, sure, can somebody read your personal statement before work and activities? Yes, but most people will read it straight through. So they'll get your for AMCAS, for people who aren't familiar with it, that's the primary application for MD programs in the states. And so the way it works is you have a demographic section. Followed by that is your academic profile. All of your courses, all of your grade, all your grades, all those kinds of things, and then you'll have your GPA, your MCAT score, and then it'll go into work and activities section, and then finally it's your personal statement that they see last. So it really sets the stage for the stuff that's non-academic, right? Really getting to know you beyond just the sort of surface level, where you grew up and, your grades and school you went to and all that kind of stuff. So it sets the stage for understanding your actual path to medicine. Okay. And the reason why this is important is because, it sort of sets an impression, and you have the opportunity to set a very good impression, or, otherwise known as like a halo effect. So if they like you from your work activity section, they're going to judge the rest of your application more favorably. Alternatively, if you don't do a great job, then you might harm yourself, right? Because you set a bad impression, and that's really hard to recover from. So work and activities, super critical section. Okay. So, what is the format? Essentially, you are given up to 15 entries, right? So, they give you 15 slots for these entries. You don't have to get to all of them. That's a common concern that students have, which we'll talk about too. And for each of these 15 entries, you're given a 700 character limit to write a description. Okay. So, and this is, by the way, this screenshot, what you're seeing here, this rectangle, that's actually what it looks like on the AMCAS application. Okay, so you get up to 15 of these. They ask you to choose an experience type, which we'll get into in a moment. In this case, in this example, it's a medical or clinical volunteering / community service opportunity. The experience name. So, what did you actually do? Where was it? The contact name and title. The contact name and title is basically sort of like someone who can, verify that you work there, or can test you work there, or give an evaluation of it. So you would list their names. Now, I should say that I've never come across someone, a student telling me, my contact person was contacted, all this kind of stuff. I'm sure it's happened, or sometimes does happen, but it's not a very common thing. So sometimes students really worry about that. Let's say it's something that didn't have like a clear supervisor or something like that, and they put somebody else's name. They worry about, okay, will that fly? And it's usually going to be fine. And then you put the organization name, where it was, the dates you worked there, and whether or not it was considered a most meaningful experience. We'll get into most meaningful experiences a little bit later, but I'll say that so you get up to 15 sort of core entries, I call them. And of those 15, you can choose three and designate them as most meaningful, and you're given additional space. We'll cover that later. So, but that's what, when you see here, most meaningful experience, that's what we're talking about. And then the dates that you worked at this experience, right? So there might have been a break, so you might separate those and so on. And then an experience description. So you talk about what you did. Most of the time, you'll want to have a sort of narrative description to it, right? So sometimes people say it's okay if you have bullets. I think that's okay. Like if you're talking about shadowing or publications, things where, it's okay if you write the information in a very sort of listicle sort of way. But for the most part, you want to have a paragraph description. All right. So there you go. You see how the most meaningful activities will show up. So right under core description, if you designate it as most meaningful, you get an additional 1,325 characters. So you get the 700 plus the separate 1,325 characters. And this essentially, gets you to talk about why it was most meaningful to you, to share a little bit more than, what you just did, right? Maybe go deeper into why it was valuable. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the categories. And I was just looking at my watch just now. The reason I'm looking at it is because I this camera after 30 minutes sometimes shuts off automatically. So if that happens and I go black on the screen, I'll keep talking just so you know I'm still here. And but yeah, all right. So the categories. There are, I believe, 18. There's community service and volunteering, medical or clinical. So sometimes people just call this clinical volunteering. That's sort of how it's known in the community. Or you could say non-clinical volunteering. So an example of clinical volunteering would be like, if you're at UCLA and you do care extenders, or you work at a hospital and you're delivering direct patient care. Basically, the sort of the saying, or the way people think about it is, if you're close enough to the patient where you can smell them. I know it sounds weird, but essentially that's sort of how people decide, is this clinical, not, am I actually delivering patient care? So this is distinct from shadowing. This is different, distinct from scribing, where you're actually delivering care. But then the smell sort of, that shorthand, or that rule of thumb, especially, I think, especially got challenged during COVID, when people were doing a lot of remote work, especially students, probably more than ever, were doing work like suicide hotline work or crisis text line and things like that. Those are still delivering direct patient care, right? So it doesn't have to be physical in person, but direct care provision. All right. So community service, volunteering, non medical or clinical. That's like, let's say you, I don't know, did after school tutoring for kids from lower income backgrounds or something like that. That would be considered non clinical volunteering. Physician shadowing is where you essentially observe a physician doing their work. And then a research or lab opportunity is, what it sounds like. You would join a research lab and do various things there, maybe work on manuscripts, run experiments, data entry, and so on. Presentations and posters. Again, if you had a poster as a conference, or you gave a talk on your research, that's what would count. Conferences attended, what it sounds like. Publications, so these would be like journal manuscripts and peer-reviewed publications. Honors, awards, and recognitions, right? So if you want a special prize, paid employment, medical or clinical, paid employment, not medical or clinical, like if you worked at an ice cream shop, or whatever the case might be. If you worked at a TA or did some other sort of teaching, other sort of leadership, military service, athletics, artistic endeavors, hobbies, generic extracurricular activities, and other, if something doesn't fit anywhere else. So interestingly, you notice how with athletics it says intercollegiate athletics. So basically, not like I play basketball for fun, but more so I did this at the college level, essentially. Okay. One thing I should say, I get questions a lot about, okay, I did a lot of paid employment for medical and clinical realm, like I worked as an EMT. Do I also need, volunteer level clinical work, right? So the answer to that is not necessarily. So I pulled up the Q&A. Let me move it to the side. Um, so essentially, so that's not necessary. Some people think it is, it's not. I mean, the reason why we sort of bolded and put an asterisk on these four is that, these are the four that are like critical to have, right? It's not critical if you aren't an intercollegiate athlete, of course, but it is critical to do research, shadowing, to do community service, and also, do medically relevant volunteering. And if it's paid, it's not a big, and all you have is paid clinical experience, that's not really an issue. Some people might say, well, yeah, you have to do it on a community service basis. Yeah, it's good. But if, again, what they want to see is a heart for service. So if you had a bunch of non-clinical volunteering, but then you had, a bunch of, paid medical work, like you did EMT work for years and years and years, and really you devoted yourself to the community service side of things to do, like, I don't know, let's call it like, like the after school tutoring programs or something like that, that's okay. Your heart for service comes through. All right, we have a few questions here. I'll tackle them before I move on. How many clinical hours are necessary to be competitive at top med schools for students who don't take a gap year? Will admissions committees take into account the difficulty of gaining clinical hours during the pandemic? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, they will. Now, we don't quite know exactly how each admissions committee will handle that sort of thing, because it's unprecedented, right? And the question essentially is, will they lower their expectations given the context, given our times? Um, Schools will be understanding that, so many things were close to non-essential workers. At the same time, there have been many students who have excelled during this time. They started their own initiatives. They've, they've joined opportunities like remote, patient care opportunities, suicide hotline, things of that nature. They've also devoted themselves to service in a major way. So I wouldn't rely fully on, well, they're going to be totally understanding. I think they will, but the degree is unclear. And the 2020 to 2021 cycle, the one that's ending now, when we're recording this in February of 2021, you know at this time, well, I guess that cycle, for the most part, most students had done the vast majority of their extracurriculars going into the cycle. This year, this 2021 to 2022 cycle is very interesting because it's been now almost a whole year since we were on stay-at-home orders, or very limited you know leaving home opportunities, or outside opportunities, I should say. So time will tell. But the goal is to always do the best you can in the situation that you're in. So even if you can't do a specific in-person experience, well, what did you do instead, right? How did you spend your time? Where's your heart when it comes to these things? And the second question, how would you choose which category to place an activity if it falls into multiple categories? That's a complicated question. It depends, because it also depends on where you've already spent your time. So, for instance, if you had a bunch of experiences that were community service and volunteering, but you don't have anything in under leadership or something like that, you might want to use it that way, or vice versa. If you had a bunch in other areas, but something can be considered one of those four core experiences, you might want to use it there. So there's a bit of a strategy to it. You don't want to over strategize, and you don't have to try and hit as many different categories as possible. You just want to have those core four for sure, and then the others, obviously do it in the place that it fits best. All right, so I'll keep going. I know there are a lot of person specific questions. I'm in this situation, I'm in that situation, etc. Someone asked about, shadowing multiple physicians. How does that fit? I'll cover that soon. So I'll keep going for now. Okay, so how to choose the most meaningful experiences. Okay, so the you get up to 15. You don't have to fill all 15 slots. Sometimes people say, well, how many should I fill? I would say if you can get 10 plus, great. 12 plus, wonderful. But it's not about quantity. It truly is about quality. So if you did things at a very deep level, that's going to be more important than the specific number. But I would say if you can get to that 10 to 12 numbers, that's great. And anything else, would be bonus. But again, that's also not a hard and fast thing. So I don't want you to be so obsessive about making sure I need to hit 12 or anything like that. All right. So how to choose most meaningful experiences? Simple. Select the ones that are actually most meaningful to you. I think that people, again, over strategize when it comes to this. Well, I talked about this in the personal statement, so I shouldn't talk about this here. And I'm talking about this in my secondary, so I shouldn't use it here. Almost like trying to game the system to their favor, but doesn't quite work that way. The only rule I would say, and I say rule like this is because it's not actually a rule. It's a rule that I have for our students. You should have at least one healthcare related activity as one of your most meaningful, because otherwise it's kind of weird, right? You're saying you want to go into medicine, but you're not. None of your three most meaningful experiences are healthcare related or research related. That's kind of strange, right? So I would say one plus healthcare related. Two, great, but doesn't have to be all three. Even but of course, if your most meaningful experiences, all three are medically relevant, that's great. That's a solid situation to be in, but I wouldn't stress it if you're not at all. All right. So, what do admissions committees want to know when they evaluate their work and activity section, or each entry? Number one, how much time? So this is the 5 point formula I was talking about. Number one, how much time you spent. Okay. Your responsibilities and accomplishments, right? So you can spend a lot of time but not achieve a lot, or you can spend little time and achieve a lot, right? So that really matters. The impact you made. So, okay, you did all this stuff, you achieved a lot, but like, how did it actually help people? What qualities did you demonstrate? In other words, what did we learn about you based on your participation in these various activities? And then so that's what you want to cover in your core descriptions. And for most meaningful, you additionally want to add what you learned and how you grew. You could talk about that a little bit in a core description, in a 700 character description, but it's really in the most meaningful experience section where you're going to talk about how you grew from it. Okay. And like anecdotes and things of that nature. All right. So let's get into an example. How to write these descriptions. Step one, List every extracurricular experience during your college and post grad years. So your obviously your resume would be very helpful for this. If there were, if there were things like shadowing or awards that you're not going to say a ton about, you can group those together, right? Sometimes people will try and to have four separate shadowing entries because they want to have quantity, but unless it's something special, I probably would group them together. Step number three is write brief descriptions for each of the five areas that they want to know. So the previous slide is what covers it. So let's get into an example. All right. So let's say you were an assistant cook at the Chicago homeless shelter. This is a made up experience. And the time spent, you write down, obviously you put in that one section in that you saw in the example I showed you earlier. There was, I worked on this month to this month, this many hours. And so you basically want to write this down because it also helps you come up with your most meaningful decision. So write down time you spent, what were your responsibilities and your accomplishments. So this person prepared meals and served homeless individuals. The impact they made, or impact they experienced, where they developed lasting relationships with underserved individuals. Qualities demonstrated: kindness, encouraging, interested in people from all walks of life. And the lessons and the growth here were gratitude, humility, and human resilience. Okay, or observing human resilience. All right, so let's get into it. What does it actually look like? So, step four, you should write out your experience, emphasizing your responsibilities and accomplishments, achievements, and demonstrated qualities. All right, so let's get into an actual example, and then we'll talk about what each of those different sentences cover. So I started out as a volunteer dishwasher and porter, and occasionally helped with cooking meals when the cooks were out for any reason. So that was the responsibility. Okay. After about a year, the head chef asked me to transition to cooking only. Another accomplishment and responsibility. I was excited about the opportunity because cooking is one of my greatest passions. 2 nights per week, I cooked and served various meals for the local homeless community. As a cook, I initially ate with the other kitchen staff after everyone had been served. Over time, however, I ate with the people I served and encouraged other staff members to join as well. So, impact, the demonstration of kindness, encouragement, and interest in others. So, none of those words are used, those quality words, but they come through because they did a great job. Okay. And so for the additional 1,325 characters that you would use to describe the most meaningful experiences, this is how it would look. So the example, assistant cook at the Chicago homeless shelter. When I started volunteering at the homeless shelter, I was looking forward to accumulating volunteer hours doing something I enjoyed. However, serving some of our society's most needy members and developing lasting relationships with them quickly trumped the pleasure of cooking. I recognized early on that my service could transcend swinging meals onto a plate. While our diners clearly needed nourishment, they were also looking for community. Simply asking many of them how their weeks were going about their upbringing, or sorry, excuse me, how their weeks were going, about their upbringing, and eventually how they became homeless, got them to share their stories. These stories stirred up feelings of gratitude and humility, knowing that many of my blessings, example, growing up in a nice neighborhood with an intact family, were unearned. In addition, I came to understand how resilient human beings are. Against great odds, many homeless individuals had developed and maintained a positive life outlook, and some were able to improve their housing and career situations. While I was always glad to learn about these developments, I was sad to lose touch with these friends. I suppose this experience parallels the goal of a medical doctor to not be needed anymore. So a few things here. There are, usually, I'm looking at this too and identifying opportunities for improvement. Usually, when you talk about, people with a certain condition or in a certain situation, you don't want to use that as an adjective. So, you would want to write something like individuals who are homeless rather than homeless individuals, and not huge, huge, huge deal, but something to think about. The same way you would want to say, children with autism, not autistic children. So something I want you to keep in mind as you write. I think it shows an extra level of sensitivity. The other thing I will say is if you look at the end, I suppose this experience parallels the goals of a medical doctor. It's not imperative for every single experience to end with a note about how it's going to make you a better physician or something like that. If it works, if it's an easy way to insert it, great. But if you force it, it'll sound super cheesy. Like, for instance, like if you play hockey for fun, right? And you're like, I've enjoyed playing hockey my whole life, all this kind of stuff. And then saying something like, and the teamwork and camaraderie are just like the, you know, that's the kind of teamwork I need on the patient floor, or something like that. That's kind of cheesy. It's kind of a stretch. So if it feels like a stretch, it probably is. And you don't need to write that kind of sentence to tie it all together. All right. So common mistakes for the work and activity section. Focusing on personal statement preparation at the cost of the work and activity section. We talked about this earlier, right? So people get obsessive about their personal statement, but when it comes to their work and activity section, they're like, whatever. But you want to take this as seriously. They talk too much about the activity and not about their impact. So they talk about like like what they did, like almost like a resume, like did this, did this, did this, did this. Well, you're not adding any sort of flavor to it, any sort of you know human interest, if you will, right? So you want to have it be rich. They write to fill the maximum character count. This is a good one, right? So just because you have 700 characters or 1325 characters doesn't mean you need to fill them all. If you can, great. And if it's good, great. But again, focus on quality above all. Writing in phrases, right? So yeah, so bullets or short sentences like did this, did that, did that, did that. That can get kind of boring and repetitive because when admissions committee members, there you go with the camera turning black. Here I am again. When they read so many of these applications, they sort of it can get to be a lot. So you want to keep people, engaged. And using abbreviations. It's okay to use an abbreviation, but you have to spell it out if it's not common. Like, let's say if I worked at NASA, NASA is fine. Everyone knows NASA. But if I worked at the MIL, I just made that up, by the way. But again, no one knows what the MI. It's not like that everyone recognizes that, like USA or NASA or UCLA or something like that, right? So make sure that when you use an abbreviation, you're very thoughtful. Okay, does everybody know this? If not, write it out the first time so we actually know what you're doing. You can even write in the organization name. You can write the abbreviation so that you can then or like the acronym so that you can then use that in your entry. And then remember, no new future activities. Okay, so if you're going to talk about stuff like, oh well, starting in November I'm actually going to do X, Y, and Z, usually you want to have things in the work and activity section that you've already started. Now if you started it right before your application, that's great. Otherwise, you could talk about it in gap year plans or in update letters and things like that. All right, keep going. Common mistakes continued. Spreading out the activities that can be combined under a single entry. So this is like if you have a publication, across like 3 publications and they're across 3 different entries. Now, if one was particularly meaningful because it related to, I don't know, some prize you won or it's in your area of greatest interest, sure, but don't do it just to fill multiple slots. Using space to describe positions that are widely recognized, for example, EMT or tutor. Now, what do we mean by this? Essentially, like don't talk about what an EMT does. Talk about what you did. As an EMT, did it. I was exposed to X, Y, and Z. Not EMTs do all this kind of stuff. Tutor, a primary responsibility of a tutor is to teach math, science, or any other subject. You don't want to go so basic where it's like, well, we know this already, so sort of get to the heart of it, get to the meat. Um, Assuming that a reader is familiar with a less recognized activity or award. Yeah, something might be very big at your school, but it might not be known to other people or places, folks at other places. So be mindful of that. Repeating information that can be gathered from the activity header. Great. This is a great one. So, if you wrote, hmm, let's say like a patient care liaison at such and such organization, you know, because space is so limited, you don't need to say, as a patient care liaison at such and such medical center, I, da 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 da. Just start I and go with it. Okay. And then finally, the obvious insufficient proofreading, right? So you're going to be writing so much during the medical school application process. It's very easy and very tempting to sometimes say, okay, like I'm not going to read it, double check all that kind of stuff. Make sure to pay attention to detail is huge. All right. So other piece of advice I'd like to give, use the work and activity section to tell a cohesive story about yourself and identify a niche in medicine that interests you. It's really nice when multiple experiences fit together. Okay. So for instance, if you've done like psychiatry research, you've worked with, you've done suicide hotline work, and also your patient care experiences are, have to do with, other like kids with mental health, or your service experiences are with like mental health education for, some ethnic minority community for whom, pursuing mental health care services is kind of taboo or something like that. Those would, have a nice sort of cohesive narrative to them, but essentially use the different experience to work together to tell a story. Next, activities accomplishments from high school are only relevant if they demonstrate continuity. What do we mean by that? If you did something in senior year of high school and stopped, and you never did it once starting college, don't include it. But if you started something in senior year and you continued it through junior year of college, you can use the high school start date as your start date, okay, to demonstrate continuity. That's sort of the rule. When did it start? When did it end? If a publication has been accepted, cite it properly, provide the PubMed ID. If something's under review, or you probably shouldn't write about a manuscript in preparation. You could mention, hey, we're preparing a manuscript on X. If something's been submitted and it's under review, perhaps you can sort of use the citation and say under review. But typically, you want to reserve it for stuff that's either in press, meaning it's been accepted, but it hasn't yet been published, or something that's already out. Yeah. So if a publication has been prepared or is under review, stated in the description. So be mindful of like, don't oversell things, right? So if you're still in the process of writing or it's under review, like, be clear about that. Don't try to mislead. Sometimes I have had students before who assumed something would get accepted, so they wrote the publication as though it was accepted, and they said, like, it's going in this journal, all that kind of stuff, only to get rejected. And they're like, oh my gosh, like, is this dishonest? Well, technically it was, because, you sort of said it was ready and going to be published before it was. So be honest. If you wrote about an activity in the personal statement, don't copy and paste it, right? So add a different angle. And this comes up a lot. Like, if I wrote something in my personal statement, can I also write about it in the work activity section? If something, can I write about it in the most meaningful section? Should I save something for the personal statement or the work activities versus writing about it in both? No need to over strategize like this. You can always talk about things from a different angle. So remember, the personal statement is your personal and professional path to medicine. If you talk about research, you could talk about how, working with patients got you interested in scientific discovery, which led you to research, or how doing research, was great, but you still want to get closer to actual patients, so you went to patient care. It's the story of how you chose different experiences. In the work activity section, it's more nitty gritty, what you did, what you learned, things like that. Okay. So the different angle matters. Um, and then we talked about this before about, new future activities. Use numbers to be persuasive, right? So if you did some fundraising and you raised $50,000, well, that's different from, making a few hundred from a bake sale, right? So highlight actual tangible impacts when you can. And then do not include an activity that you cannot speak about in depth during an interview. Good one. So what this means is, essentially, everything you write in your application is fair game. You can be asked about it, you can be grilled about it. So make sure that these are things that you feel comfortable discussing. All right. So the summary is, demonstrate depth and commitment. It's not about quantity, it's about quality and depth. Second, not every activity must be healthcare related, but make sure to include physician shadowing, both medical and not medical, community service and volunteering. Again, if you just have paid work in the clinical sphere, not the end of the world. If you have community service on top of that, even better, but not the end of the world if it's just the paid. And then research, very critical, especially at MD programs, and also DO program. It's not like one cares and one doesn't. There's a big misconception within the pre-med community that, like, top schools are considered research schools. But then, schools outside the top 20, like, care less about it. But no, all these are academic medical centers, and they all care about your pursuit of, scientific medicine. Highlight your impact on the position and the position's impact on you. That sort of transactional nature. Allow readers to, pull out the qualities from you without you having to say, I was very generous in doing X. Just demonstrate your generosity. And then remember, you'll have a chance to expand and provide updates in secondary essays, interviews, and through letters of interest and intent. So don't be like, oh my gosh, I wish I had more space. I'm going to, like, use a second entry or talk about, the same thing across shadowing across multiple entries, or like, it's okay. You'll have plenty of space to cover it all. I promise. When you get to secondaries, you'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm still writing. So there's plenty of opportunity to cover it all. So yeah, go ahead, Christina. Hi.
I'm here.
Oh, I thought someone was speaking. I heard a voice.
No, they can only ask questions in Q&A.
Oh, all right. Um, cool. So I just wanted to, provide some encouragement here. Oh, I don't know what that. Maybe it was used it in the past, but essentially, there were just some student results on there just to show you, like, at this point, you're probably feeling really anxious, right? And you're anxious about, like, okay, is this actually going to work out for me? And given how so few students get in, relatively speaking, and so roughly around 40% each year. But if you approach this process the right way, you can have tremendous success with the process. And you have to do things deliberately, right? If you sort of look around, read on, the Reddits and SDNs of the world, what, advice people are giving, and, ask about what are my chances just based on numbers alone, you'll sort of miss the forest from the trees. And so my advice is really, like, take it step by step. Use each section for what it's uniquely good for. Again, personal statement, high level, why medicine, work activity section, really to be used for day to day what you did, how you spent your time. Secondary is a school specific fit. Your school list, make sure that it's appropriately competitive and conservative. So make sure to balance that out. Rec letters, choose them very, carefully. Interviews, prep for them well. But if you do each of these sections very well and use them, ideally, you'll maximize your chances of getting in. So don't sleep on the work and activity section. Very quickly, I just wanted to say thank you before I move on to all your questions. So
Thank you so much,
sorry.
Shirag, and you have plenty of questions
Yes,
in
yes, there are
the
plenty of
Q&A.
questions, and yeah, and I'm sorry, there appears to be some audio attached to some of the slides, and I'll have to look into that. But yeah, so there are a bunch of questions here that I am happy to go through if people are willing to hang out with me. Love to be here. Okay, so I think I answered the how many clinical hours are necessary to be considered for top med schools. So I would say you should really aim for 150 plus hours on the minimum side of clinical hours. But again, hours are just the shorthand for understanding the depth of an experience, right? You can have fewer hours but have a stronger experience because of the impact you made. So that's the way I think about it. How would you choose which category to place an activity under if it falls under multiple? Answer that one as well. Again, do the one that it fits in the most neatly. But at the end of the day, if you have some really important categories that are missing, then that's how you should fill that. All right. Is it worth starting a new activity like volunteering for a crisis hotline now if you're applying during the 21-22 cycle? It's not about the start date. It's about, like, making sure that you're doing everything. So for instance, like, if you don't have sufficient patient exposure experience, you should absolutely start getting more patient experience right now, rather than wait. Don't think about it like, well, it's February, it's just a few months out. Now, if you haven't had any, service or research or patient exposure opportunities, and it's right before the cycle, that's not good, because it's going to look like you sort of got it last minute and tried to check a box. So you have to be very mindful about how that will come across. All right. You were in a position where you were a shadow student, but sometimes you would help translate for patients when needed. Would that be considered physician shadowing or community service and volunteering? I would go with what it was officially. So if you're officially a shadower, right, you're a shadower. In the description, rather than just say, Dr. So and so, this many hours, this field, write about what you did during that shadowing experience. That's how you would add richness. I wouldn't necessarily change the experience category. If you shadow multiple physicians, can they be listed under one category? Yes, we actually have our AMCAS work and activities guide on our site. It's very comprehensive, and there are actually examples of how to do that. Could scribing be considered shadowing? It could, but it's you can sort of elevate that experience. So scribing is an interesting experience. I'm glad you brought this up. It sort of falls somewhere in between like traditional shadowing and direct patient contact, because you're not actually delivering care, but you're more involved with the care team than just shadowing. So I would say if you don't have any, let's say you don't have any shadowing, but you have 500 hours of scribing, you could, I suppose, pull out some of those hours, 50 of those hours, 60 of those hours, and designate them as shadowing, and then use the rest as scribing. But just make sure to, again, talk about them from different angles. All right. If you have a paid employment in a hospital, does this also apply to clinical observations? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but it depends what you were doing. Like if you were working in the billing office, probably not. But if you were some sort of tech, like an X-ray tech or something like that, well, then that would be a different sort of healthcare experience. And again, if you saw stuff but you want to pull out some of the hours because you're lacking some in another category, you might be able to do that. Someone says, I had a hospice and shadowing planned to start last summer, but they were canceled or postponed due to COVID. Should I mention this in the explanation box so admissions don't believe I'm starting them off last second just to check necessary boxes off? Yeah, so I brought this up just a few minutes back. Um, yeah, you could talk about why it was cut short, but also talk about your plans for joining again. Maybe you're going to get your vaccine soon if you haven't already, and you're going to rejoin or something like that. But then, talk about what you did with that time. All right. So, how would you categorize being a community advisory board member for a research collaborative under UCLA Health? So I don't know if it was a paid position. I suppose it depends on whether it was clinical or non-clinical. But that's I would probably do paid employment. If it was non-paid, then again, same thing. Was it community service or volunteering under non-clinical or clinical? That's how I would make that decision. Melissa asks, can we include prospective hours? Mention that we will be continuing the activity in our gap year for an activity currently in progress. Yes, I believe you can say, present, or that it's continuing. Or even if you have to put, if the application system changes and you have to put, the current date as the sort of end date, that's where you could talk about it in the description itself, but that should be fine. Is physician shadowing necessary if you have significant clinical experiences elsewhere? I would aim to have a separate shadowing experience. So if you have no shadowing but tons of patient exposure hours, again, I would pull out some of those hours, that you were observing physicians. So that, let's say if it was 500 and you use, I don't know, 60 and 440, you might want to do something like that. What are good options for COVID activities aside from research? Well, there's all sorts of, um, community service opportunities. There are remote clinical opportunities, like I said. You can suicide hotline, crisis text line are two classic ones. You can start to get certifications for medical assistant or EMT because those are considered essential healthcare workers and they never sort of go out of work. So those are things you can think about. Where can we learn more about other topics you present on, like writing a personal statement? Well, we have a massive guide online. It's like tens of thousands of words long with 20 plus examples. So you could type my last name, so Shemmassian Medical School Personal Statement, you'll find it. We also have a presentation with the UCLA Career Center. I presented on it, and
And
I
it
believe it's on
is
YouTube.
it
Yeah.
is accessible on the UCLA Career Center's YouTube channel and also on the Pre-Health at UCLA Facebook page. I'm going to put those links in the chat so everybody can familiarize themselves with. We have a lot of webinars recorded, and personal statements. We do critique personal statements. So if you need help with that, we can help too.
Yeah. So you've got some great resources. Thank you, Christina, for confirming that. And how does virtual shadowing count for overall shadowing? Yeah, virtual shadowing is kind of a new thing, sort of popped up everywhere during COVID. People ask, is it going to be seen as prestigious and all this kind of stuff and as meaningful? The answer is, I suppose schools are going to be very understanding if that's like your only shadowing experience, or sorry, if you got a bunch of virtual shadowing hours during COVID. But I would still encourage you to try and get it as things open up, because you don't want to have that be the only shadowing hours you got. Okay. So someone asks, how can we, oh, sorry, I was scrolling up. Should the 700 character descriptions be more straightforward or anecdotal? Um, I suppose by anecdotal, you mean like, should there be like a story and an example and a narrative? I would say between those two, straightforward, but don't just make it, like I said, bulleted. Have it in a paragraph form, have it be a little narrative. That's okay. How can we describe transferring from a private school to community college, then to UCLA? It makes me look like a flight risk. but I obtained a 3.9 throughout all the changes. Also allowed me to get to UCLA, so it's truly beneficial. um, you could talk about that in your personal statement if you want to talk about your educational journey, or in the secondary essay. But you know with these kinds of things, I have to say, if you did well academically, people are going to ask very few questions, right? If you had gotten a 3.1 at one school, and then at the private school, then went to community college, got a 3.9, then went to UCLA and got 3.4, then that's a problem, because you're doing less well at the more rigorous places, or arguably more rigorous places. But if you did very well, it's going to be, I think, less critical to talk too much about it. Can we get access to these slides after? So I won't be circulating the slides, but the presentation, I believe, is being recorded, and it will be up, so you can watch this again and follow along that way. What is considered a competitive number of hours for research? It's for sure, but it's more about what you did. How long were you there? What did you contribute? Were you on a publication? Things like that. How many hours should you be shadowing physicians? I would say 50 to 75. I wouldn't go more than 100, because that's the one activity where, like, more after a certain point is just diminishing returns. Let's see. What do you think about virtual shadowing? Answer that. Um, if I take if I take 2 gap years, can I still list activities that I did in college on my application? Yes. If you got licensed as an EMT but didn't work as one, should it be excluded? You could include it, but obviously what you're going to be able to say about it is going to be quite limited. During COVID-19, would online health shadowing sessions on sites such as YouTube or Zoom meetings officially count towards shadowing hours? There's no such thing as official counting of shadowing hours, but yeah, can you certainly write about your include shadowing experiences that were accrued virtually? Yes, that would be fine. Again, but that shouldn't be all of your shadowing hours. Do I know if interviews will be online this year or in person? Good question. We haven't hit interviews yet for the 2021 to 2022 cycle. Some schools have started talking about how they're probably going to stick with online. Some might go hybrid. I doubt. Again, this is my suspicion, but I doubt that there will be schools that require in-person interviews during the 21 to 22 cycle. Again, I may be wrong, and things might change, especially if there are mass vaccinations and all this, and the research and the outcomes are really promising. That might be true, but as of now, um, from everything that I've heard and been hearing, it's gonna either stay fully remote or be a hybrid, and offer students choice. And then I'll take this final question. If we did research but we quit after 2 years and didn't enjoy it much, should we still write about it in the application? Yes. I'm afraid it comes up in an interview. I won't be able to talk about it as well and passionately. That's okay. You should still use that to your advantage, because that's 2 years that you devoted. You don't want to leave that off either, because you're gonna, I think, harm yourself by leaving it off, and you can worry about how to talk about it later on. All right. So with that, I'll end. I'm just so grateful again to the Career Center team for setting this up, for having me back, but also all of you for participating. This was an awesome. Apparently, we answered 24. Well, especially with the other two, we answered 26 questions, talked, and covered a lot. So I'm just really grateful for your attention and your participation, and I'm just thrilled that it was valuable to you.
Thank you so much, Shirag, again. And as
Yeah,
I
you're welcome.
mentioned before, we have some resources for you on the Pre-Health at UCLA Facebook page and also on the YouTube channel. And we do have a Pre-Health at UCLA website as well. And we are here for pre-health counseling. So feel free to come to talk to us as well. And I put Shirag's website on the chat, in addition to the YouTube and Pre-Health at UCLA Facebook page links. So thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Take care, y'all.